The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the winding mountain road. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine, and the promise of a cold night. The dense forest on either side of the road seemed to close in, creating a tunnel of shadows. In the dimming light, the asphalt appeared almost black, and the white lane markers gleamed like ghostly specters. Yuki and Hiroshi had been driving for hours. They were on their way to a remote cabin that Yuki's family owned, seeking a weekend of relaxation away from the city's chaos. Yuki, a slender woman with short, dark hair, sat in the passenger seat, studying the map on her phone. Hiroshi, a sturdy man with a calm demeanor, focused on the road ahead. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind shared by people who know each other well. As they passed mile marker 13, a thick fog began to roll in, creeping over the road like a living entity. The headlights of their car cut through the mist, but visibility was rapidly diminishing. Yuki glanced up from her phone, her brow furrowing. "This fog came out of nowhere," she remarked, a hint of unease in her voice. Hiroshi nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Yeah, it's strange. The weather forecast didn't mention anything about fog." The fog grew denser with each passing moment, swallowing the trees and the road ahead. The world outside the car became an indistinct blur of grey and white. Hiroshi slowed the car to a crawl, his eyes straining to see more than a few feet in front of them. "We should pull over," Yuki suggested. "It's too dangerous to keep driving like this." Hiroshi nodded in agreement. He carefully guided the car to the side of the road and turned on the hazard lights. The thick fog enveloped them, muting the sounds of the forest and the occasional passing car. It felt as though they were in a world of their own, isolated from everything else. Yuki shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. "This fog is creepy. It's almost unnatural." Hiroshi reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "We'll wait it out. It should clear up soon." They sat in silence, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. The tension in the car was palpable, an unspoken fear that something was wrong. Hiroshi turned on the radio, hoping to find some news or distraction. But all they got was static. "Great," he muttered, switching it off. "No signal out here." Yuki peered into the fog, her eyes narrowing. "Did you see that?" Hiroshi followed her gaze, but saw nothing but swirling mist. "See what?" There was something out there, a shape moving through the fog. Hiroshi felt a chill run down his spine. Probably just an animal. "The forest is full of them." Yuki didn't look convinced. It didn't look like an animal. It was too human. Hiroshi swallowed hard, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up his spine. "Let's just stay in the car and wait. It's safer." The fog seemed to grow thicker, if that were possible, and the world outside the car became even more obscure. Yuki kept her eyes fixed on the window, watching for any signs of movement. Hiroshi glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It had only been 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the back of the car. Both Yuki and Hiroshi jumped, their hearts racing. Hiroshi quickly turned around, but all he could see was the dense fog, pressing against the rear window. "What was that?" Yuki whispered, her voice trembling. Hiroshi shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know. Stay here. I'll check it out." "No." Yuki grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't go out there. It's too dangerous." Hiroshi hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect and the rational fear of the unknown. "We need to know what it is. It could be someone in trouble." Reluctantly, Yuki let go of his arm. "Be careful." Hiroshi nodded and opened the car door, stepping out into the thick, oppressive fog. The cold air bit into his skin, and he shivered as he made his way to the back of the car. The fog seemed to swallow him whole, reducing his visibility to almost nothing. He felt around, his hands trembling, but found nothing unusual. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a faint whispering sound, barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. He strained to listen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and he realized it was not just one voice, but many, overlapping and indistinct. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small and frightened in the thick fog. There was no response, just the incessant whispering. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to return to the safety of the car. As he turned, he caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving through the fog, its form indistinct and ghostly. "Hiroshi!" Yuki's voice cut through the fog, filled with panic. He didn't need any more urging. He bolted back to the car, flinging the door open and jumping inside. He slammed the door shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What did you see?" Yuki demanded, her eyes wide with fear. "There was someone out there," Hiroshi panted. "Or something. I couldn't see it clearly." Yuki's face paled. "We need to get out of here." Hiroshi nodded, starting the car. The engine roared to life, but the fog was so thick that he could barely see the road. He put the car in gear and slowly began to drive, the headlights cutting through the fog like knives. As they drove, the whispering seemed to follow them, growing louder and more insistent. Hiroshi's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Yuki kept looking over her shoulder, her fear palpable. "Faster, Hiroshi," she urged, her voice trembling. "We need to get away from here." Hiroshi pressed the accelerator, but the fog was so dense that he couldn't go much faster without risking an accident. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, and he could feel a cold sweat trickling down his back. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Illuminated by the headlights, Hiroshi swerved to avoid it, the car skidding on the wet asphalt. They came to a screeching halt, the figure vanishing into the fog. Yuki screamed, her hands covering her face. "What was that?" Hiroshi's heart pounded in his chest. "I don't know. It looked like a person." They sat in the car, the engine idling, the fog pressing in on them from all sides. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost worse. "We can't stay here," Yuki said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to keep moving." Hiroshi nodded, putting the car back in gear. They continued down the road, the fog still thick and oppressive. The further they went, the more it felt like they were driving into a nightmare from which there was no escape. As they approached a bend in the road, the fog began to thin slightly, and they saw a dim light ahead. It was a small, roadside shrine, its lantern flickering in the foggy night. Hiroshi pulled the car over, and they both got out, drawn to the light like moths to a flame. The shrine was old and weathered, its wooden beams covered in moss. The lantern cast long shadows, giving the place an otherworldly feel. Yuki and Hiroshi exchanged a look, their fear momentarily replaced by curiosity. "Let's take a look," Yuki suggested, her voice hushed. Hiroshi nodded, and they approached the shrine, the fog swirling around them. As they reached the entrance, they saw a small, carved plaque with an inscription. It read, "Beware the spirits that haunt mile marker 13. They are restless and seek the living." A chill ran down their spines as they read the words. Yuki turned to Hiroshi, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave now." Hiroshi didn't argue. They hurried back to the car and drove away from the shrine. The fog slowly beginning to lift, the whispering had stopped, replaced by an uneasy silence that seemed to follow them. They drove in silence, the tension slowly easing as the fog thinned and the road became clearer. By the time they reached the cabin, the fog had completely dissipated, leaving only the memory of their terrifying encounter. As they settled into the cabin, neither Yuki nor Hiroshi could shake the feeling that something had followed them. The events of the night replayed in their minds, a chilling reminder of the unknown horrors that lurked in the fog over mile marker 13. Yuki and Hiroshi sat in the dimly lit cabin, their nerves still on edge from the night's harrowing encounter. The cabin, nestled deep in the forest, was a stark contrast to the chairs of their drive. It was a cozy retreat with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and simple furnishings. Yet, the tranquility did little to dispel the lingering fear. Yuki, her hands trembling slightly, lit a fire in the fireplace. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, providing a small measure of comfort. Hiroshi sat at the small dining table, staring out the window into the dark forest beyond. The fog had lifted, but the memory of the whispering, voices and shadowy figures still haunted him. "We need to figure out what happened," Yuki said, breaking the silence. Hiroshi nodded, his expression grim. "I don't think it was just our imagination. There was something out there." Yuki shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I know. But what? And why did it target us?" Hiroshi sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know. But we need to be careful. We don't know if it's still following us." Yuki nodded, her fear palpable. "Maybe we should leave. Find another place to stay for the night." Hiroshi shook his head. "We can't drive in this state. We're both too rattled, and the roads are dangerous at night. We'll have to wait until morning." Yuki reluctantly agreed, though the thought of staying in the cabin, for the night filled her with dread. The hours dragged on, the oppressive silence, only broken by the occasional crackle of the fire. Yuki and Hiroshi tried to distract themselves, but the unease lingered like a shadow. As the night wore on, they decided to sleep in shifts, each taking turns to keep watch. Hiroshi took the first shift, sitting by the window with a flashlight, his eyes scanning the dark forest. Yuki lay on the couch, trying to rest, but unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. Sometime after midnight, Hiroshi heard the faint whispering that had plagued them on the road. He tensed, straining to hear, but the sound was elusive, like a breeze rustling through the leaves. He turned off the flashlight, hoping to get a better sense of direction, but the whispering seemed to come from all around. Yuki stirred in her sleep, mumbling something incoherent. Hiroshi moved to her side, gently shaking her awake. "Yuki, wake up. I hear it again." Yuki woke with a start, her eyes wide with fear. "What?" The whispering. Hiroshi nodded, his face pale. "Yes, it's out there." They listened in silence, the whispering growing louder, more insistent. It was a cacophony of voices, overlapping and indistinct, filling the room with an eerie presence. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door, causing both of them to jump. Yuki clutched Hiroshi's arm, her heart pounding. Who could that be at this hour? Hiroshi shook his head, moving cautiously toward the door. "I don't know. Stay behind me." He peered through the peephole, but the fog outside was too thick to see anything clearly. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. There was no answer, just the continued whispering. He took a deep breath and opened the door. A crack, shining his flashlight into the fog. There was no one there. He stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. "Hello?" The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. He scanned the area with his flashlight, but saw nothing. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a soft sobbing sound coming from the edge of the forest. "Hiroshi," Yuki whispered urgently. "Come back inside." But Hiroshi was drawn to the sound, compelled to investigate. He moved toward the forest, the sobbing growing louder, more desperate. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. He reached the tree line and saw a figure huddled on the ground, its form obscured by the fog. "Are you okay?" he asked, approaching cautiously. The figure looked up, and Hiroshi's blood ran cold. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hiroshi hesitated, fear warring with compassion. "What's wrong? What happened to you?" The woman reached out a trembling hand. "They're coming for me. Please, you have to help me." Hiroshi felt a chill run down his spine. "Who's coming for you?" Before she could answer, the whispering started again, louder and more aggressive. The woman screamed, a blood-curdling sound that sent Hiroshi stumbling back. "Yuki, help!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the fog. The woman vanished, her screams echoing through the forest. Hiroshi ran back to the cabin, his heart pounding. "Yuki, we need to leave." Now, Yuki was already by the door, her face pale with fear. "What happened? Who was that?" "I don't know," Hiroshi said, grabbing their bags. "But we can't stay here. It's not safe." They hurriedly packed their belongings and rushed to the car. As they drove away from the cabin, the whispering followed them, growing fainter with each passing mile. They didn't stop until they reached a small roadside inn several miles away. Exhausted and shaken, they checked into a room, grateful for the relative safety. As they settled in, Yuki turned to Hiroshi, her eyes filled with fear and determination. "We need to find out what happened at mile marker 13, she said. "This isn't over." Hiroshi nodded, his face set with resolve. "Agreed. We need to know the truth." The next morning, they set out to investigate, determined to uncover the mystery behind the haunting. They drove back to the area, their nerves still raw, but their determination stronger than ever. They started by visiting the local library, hoping to find any information about the history of the area. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, listened to their story with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Mile marker 13, she said, her voice tinged with unease. "There are many stories about that place. Some say it's cursed." Yuki and Hiroshi exchanged a glance. "What kind of stories?" Hiroshi asked. The librarian sighed, pulling out a dusty old book. "There have been reports of strange occurrences there for decades. People disappearing, strange lights, voices in the fog. Some say it's the spirits of those who died on that stretch of road." Yuki shivered. "Do you know if anyone has investigated these claims?" The librarian nodded. "A few years ago, a group of paranormal researchers came through. They claimed to have found evidence of supernatural activity, but they left abruptly and never returned." Hiroshi leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Do you know how we can contact them?" The librarian shook her head. "I'm afraid not, but there is one person who might be able to help. An old man who lives near mile marker 13. He's lived there all his life and knows more about the area than anyone else." Yuki and Hiroshi thanked the librarian and set out to find the old man. The drive was tense, the memory of the previous night's encounter still fresh in their minds. They reached a small, dilapidated house near mile marker 13, its windows dark and its roof sagging. An old man sat on the porch, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up as they approached, his eyes sharp and wary. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gruff. Yuki and Hiroshi introduced themselves and explained their situation. The old man listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he nodded slowly. "I've heard those whispers too, seen the shadows. You're not the first to come seeking answers. Do you know what's causing it?" Hiroshi asked. The old man sighed, setting down his carving. "It's the spirits of the restless dead, those who died in accidents on this road. They can't move on, trapped by their unfinished business." Yuki's eyes widened. "Is there any way to help them?" The old man shook his head. "I don't know, but I do know this: they won't stop until their stories are told, until someone understands their pain." Hiroshi and Yuki exchanged a determined look. "We'll do whatever it takes," Hiroshi said. "We need to find out what happened and help them move on." The old man nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and respect. "Then you'll need to dig deep. Find the records, talk to the families. Only then will you begin to understand." With the old man's guidance, Yuki and Hiroshi began their investigation in earnest. They scoured old newspapers, searched through public records, and interviewed locals who had lived in the area for years. Slowly, they pieced together a tragic story of lives cut short and unresolved grief. As they delved deeper, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. As if urging them on, they discovered that many of the accidents at mile marker 13 were not mere coincidences. There were patterns, connections, and a chilling sense of deliberate malevolence. One name kept appearing in their research: Takashi Nakamura, a man who had died in a car crash near mile marker 13 several decades ago. His death had been ruled an accident, but there were whispers of foul play, of unresolved conflicts that had led to his untimely demise. Yuki and Hiroshi knew they had to find out more about Takashi and his life. They tracked down his surviving relatives, hoping to uncover the truth. Takashi's younger sister, now an elderly woman herself, welcomed them into her home. She spoke with a heavy heart, recounting the events that had led to her brother's death. Takashi was a kind man, she said, tears in her eyes. But he had enemies, people who were jealous of him, who wanted to see him fail. Yuki and Hiroshi listened intently, their hearts heavy with the weight of the tragedy. As they left her home, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had a name, a story, and a direction. The whispers seemed to guide them, urging them to uncover the truth and bring peace to the restless spirits. They returned to mile marker 13, determined to confront the past and lay the spirits to rest. As they stood at the fateful spot, the fog began to roll in once more, thick and oppressive. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them, filling the air with an eerie presence. Yuki and Hiroshi held hands, their resolve unshaken. "We're here to help you," Yuki called out, her voice strong and clear. "We know your story, and we're here to bring you peace." The whispering intensified, the voices overlapping, forming a cacophony of sorrow and desperation. Suddenly, the fog parted, revealing the shadowy figures they had seen before. They stood silently, their eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. Hiroshi stepped forward, his heart pounding. "We know what happened to you, Takashi. We know you were wronged. We're here to make it right." The figure of Takashi stepped forward, his expression one of profound sadness and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Yuki and Hiroshi felt a surge of relief, knowing they had finally made contact. As they watched, the figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist. The whispering grew fainter, replaced by a sense of peace and closure. Yuki and Hiroshi stood in silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of their journey. They knew there was still much to do, but they had taken the first step. They had faced the darkness, uncovered the truth, and brought light to the shadows. As they drove away from mile marker 13, the fog lifted completely, revealing a clear sky and the promise of a new day. Their journey was far from over, but they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had the knowledge that they had made a difference. Together, they would continue to seek out the truth, to bring peace to the restless spirits, and to uncover the mysteries that lay hidden in the fog. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the chirping of birds provided a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the previous night. Yuki and Hiroshi drove back to mile marker 13, their determination unwavering despite the fear that still lingered in their hearts. The librarian's words echoed in their minds, urging them to dig deeper, to uncover the truth and bring peace to the restless spirits. They arrived at the old man's house once more, hoping to gain further insights into the tragic events that had unfolded on this haunted stretch of road. The old man greeted them with a solemn nod, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. "You're back," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Yuki nodded, her expression serious. "We learned about Takashi Nakamura. We believe his spirit is among those haunting mile marker 13. The old man sighed, leaning back in his chair. Takashi was a good man, but he had enemies. His death was a tragedy, one that left many questions unanswered. Hiroshi leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We need to know more about him." about what happened and why. The old man nodded slowly. Takashi was involved in a dispute with some powerful people. There were rumors of corruption, of hidden truths, that someone wanted to keep buried. His death was officially ruled an accident, but many believed it was more than that. Yuki's eyes widened. Do you have any proof? Anything that could help us uncover the truth? The old man reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. This was given to me by Takashi's sister. It's a letter he wrote shortly before his death. It might give you some clues. Yuki took the envelope with trembling hands, her heart pounding with anticipation. Thank you. We'll do our best to bring justice to Takashi and the others. As they left the old man's house, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. The letter in Yuki's hand was a tangible link to the past, a key that might unlock the secrets of mile marker 13. They returned to the cabin and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age and covered in neat, precise handwriting. Yuki began to read aloud, her voice steady but filled with emotion. To whoever finds this letter, my name is Takashi Nakamura. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer alive. I write this in the hope that my story will not be forgotten, and that justice will be served. I have uncovered evidence of corruption and deceit, perpetrated by those who hold power in this town. They have silenced those who dared to oppose them, and I fear I will be next. If anything happens to me, please find my sister. She knows the truth and can provide you with the evidence you need. Do not let my death be in vain. Yuki and Hiroshi exchanged a look, their resolve strengthened by Takashi's words. We need to find Takashi's sister, Hiroshi said, determination in his voice. She holds the key to all of this. They set out to locate her, their hearts heavy with the weight of their mission. It didn't take long to find her. She lived in a small, modest house on the outskirts of town, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. She welcomed them inside, her frail hands trembling as she offered them tea. I knew someone would come eventually, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Takashi was a brave man. He tried to stand up to the corruption, but they silenced him. Yuki and Hiroshi listened intently as she recounted the events that had led to her brother's death. She spoke of threats, of shadowy figures who had followed him, of the fear that had gripped their family. He left me a box, she said, her voice breaking. It contains all the evidence he gathered. I was too afraid to look at it, but I kept it safe, hoping that one day someone would find the courage to seek justice. She led them to a small room at the back of the house, where an old wooden box sat on a dusty shelf. Yuki and Hiroshi opened it carefully, revealing a treasure trove of documents, photographs, and tapes. They spent hours sifting through the contents, piecing together the puzzle of Takashi's investigation. The evidence was damning, implicating several prominent figures in a web of corruption and deceit. As they worked, the whispering began again, faint at first but growing louder, as if urging them on. They ignored it, their focus unwavering as they assembled the evidence. By the time they finished, the sun had set, and the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. They had everything they needed to expose the truth, but their journey was far from over. We need to take this to the authorities, Hiroshi said, his voice filled with resolve. We can't let them get away with this. Yuki nodded, her eyes filled with determination. But we also need to be careful. These people are dangerous. They won't hesitate to silence us if they find out what we're doing. They decided to make copies of the evidence, ensuring that the truth would not be lost even if something happened to them. They worked late into the night, their fear giving way to a steely resolve. As they prepared to leave, Takashi's sister handed them a small, worn journal. This was Takashi's. He kept it with him at all times. It might give you more insight into what he was dealing with. Yuki took the journal with gratitude, feeling a deep connection to the man who had sacrificed so much for the truth. Thank you. We won't let his death be in vain. They left the house, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but they were determined to see it through. As they drove back to the cabin, the whispering began again, louder and more insistent. It filled the car, drowning out their thoughts. A cacophony of voices urging them on. Yuki gripped the journal tightly, her knuckles white. We have to keep going. We can't let them win. Hiroshi nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. We'll expose the truth, no matter what it takes. The next few days were a blur of activity. They met with journalists, handed over the evidence to trusted authorities, and ensured that Takashi's story would be told. The whispering followed them everywhere, a constant reminder of the spirits who depended on them, but it also gave them strength, a reminder of the importance of their mission. As the story broke, the town was rocked by scandal. The corruption that had festered for so long was finally exposed, and those responsible were brought to justice. Takashi's name was cleared, his bravery and determination celebrated by those who had once doubted him. The spirits of mile marker 13 were finally at peace, their voices fading into silence. Yuki and Hiroshi stood at the fateful spot, their hearts heavy with a mix of sorrow and relief. They had done what they set out to do, but the journey had changed them forever. We did it, Yuki said, her voice filled with emotion. We brought them peace. Hiroshi nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. And we honored Takashi's memory. He can finally rest. As they drove away from mile marker 13 for the last time, the fog lifted, revealing a clear sky and the promise of a new beginning. Their journey had been long and difficult, but they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. Together, they would continue to seek out the truth, to bring light to the shadows, and to honor the memory of those who had been lost. They knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they were no longer afraid. They had each other, and they had the knowledge that they had made a difference. As they drove into the distance, the whispering faded into silence, replaced by the peaceful hum of the engine and the promise of a brighter future. The sun had set, casting the forest in a twilight gloom that seemed to thicken the air. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches entwined like skeletal fingers reaching out to grasp the unwary. Yuki and Hiroshi parked the car near mile marker 13, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and determination. They had returned to this haunted place one last time, driven by the need to confront the malevolent force that had tormented them and the spirits trapped here. As they stepped out of the car, the familiar fog began to roll in, dense and suffocating. The whispering started almost immediately, a chorus of voices filled with anguish and despair. Yuki shivered, her breath coming in shallow gasps. We have to do this, she whispered, more to herself than to Hiroshi. Hiroshi nodded, his expression grim. We can't leave them like this. We have to put an end to it. They walked toward the spot where they had first encountered the spirits, the fog, growing thicker with each step. The air was cold, chilling them to the bone, and the whispering seemed to come from all directions, enveloping them in a cocoon of sound. Yuki clutched the journal Takashi had left behind, the words inside, a constant reminder of the pain and suffering these spirits had endured. As they reached the fateful spot, the fog parted slightly, revealing the shadowy figures of the restless spirits. Takashi stood at the forefront, his eyes filled with sorrow and desperation. You came back, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. Yuki stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. We know what happened to you, Takashi. We know about the corruption, the deceit. We have exposed the truth. The other spirits seemed to react to her words, their forms becoming more distinct, their whispering growing louder. Hiroshi joined her, his voice steady. We have brought justice to those responsible, but we need to know how to help you move on. What can we do? Takashi's form flickered, as if struggling to maintain its cohesion. There is one final thing. The place where I died, it holds the key. You must go there, confront the darkness that lingers, and lay us to rest. Yuki and Hiroshi exchanged a look, their determination unshaken. We'll do it, Yuki said, her voice filled with resolve. We'll finish this. The fog thickened around them, the whispering growing almost deafening. The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist. "Follow the road," Takashi's voice echoed. "Find the place where the truth lies hidden." With those words, the spirits vanished, leaving Yuki and Hiroshi alone in the thickening fog. They returned to the car, their hearts heavy with the weight of their mission. They knew the road ahead would be perilous, but they were determined to see it through. They drove slowly, the fog reducing their visibility to mere feet. The whispering followed them, a constant reminder of the spirits who depended on them. After what felt like hours, they reached a bend in the road, a place where the trees seemed to close in, casting long shadows in the foggy night. Yuki's heart pounded as she recognized the spot. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where Takashi died." They got out of the car, the cold air biting into their skin. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if urging them forward. They walked toward the edge of the road, where a steep drop-off led down to a rocky ravine. The fog was so thick that they could barely see the bottom. "We need to go down there," Hiroshi said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Yuki nodded, her hands trembling. "Let's go." They carefully made their way down the rocky slope, the fog swirling around them like a living entity. The whispering seemed to grow louder, with each step filling their ears with a cacophony of voices. At the bottom of the ravine, they found the wreckage of an old car, its metal twisted and rusted with age. This was where Takashi had met his end, a tragic accident that had claimed his life. Yuki felt a chill run down her spine as she approached the wreckage. "This is where it happened," she said, her voice trembling. Hiroshi nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "We need to find whatever is keeping the spirits here, something that ties them to this place." They searched the wreckage, their hands trembling as they sifted through the debris. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic, as if urging them to find the truth. Yuki's heart skipped a beat as she found an old, leather-bound book hidden under the seat. She opened it, her breath catching as she recognized Takashi's handwriting. "It's his diary," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "He must have left it here." Hiroshi looked over her shoulder, his eyes widening as he read the words. "This is it. This is what we need to lay him to rest." Yuki began to read aloud, her voice steady, despite the fear that gripped her heart. The diary detailed Takashi's investigation, his discovery of the corruption, and the threats he had received. As she read, the whispering grew louder, the spirits' forms beginning to take shape in the fog. They surrounded Yuki and Hiroshi, their eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. "We know the truth," Yuki said, her voice strong and clear. "We have exposed the corruption, but we need to know how to help you move on." Takashi's form flickered, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You must burn the diary. Release the secrets that have bound us to this place." Yuki nodded, her resolve unshaken. She took a deep breath and held the diary over the wreckage, her hands trembling. She lit a match and set the diary ablaze, the flames quickly consuming the pages. As the diary burned, the whispering grew louder, reaching a crescendo before abruptly stopping. The spirits' forms began to dissolve, their faces filled with peace and gratitude. "Thank you," Takashi whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "You have set us free." With those words, the spirits vanished, leaving Yuki and Hiroshi alone in the ravine. The fog began to lift, revealing the clear night sky above. They stood in silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of their journey. They had faced the darkness, uncovered the truth, and brought peace to the restless spirits. "We did it," Yuki said, her voice filled with emotion. "We brought them peace." Hiroshi nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And we honored Takashi's memory. He can finally rest." As they made their way back up the slope, the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees, casting a golden glow on the forest. Their journey had been long and difficult, but they had emerged stronger. Together, they had faced the darkness and brought light to the shadows. as they drove away from mile marker 13 for the last time. The fog lifted completely, revealing a clear sky and the promise of a new beginning. Their journey was far from over, but they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had the knowledge that they had made a difference. Together, they would continue to seek out the truth, to bring peace to the restless spirits, and to uncover the mysteries that lay hidden in the fog. They knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they were ready to face them, united in their purpose and strengthened by their experiences. As they drove into the distance, the whispering faded into silence, replaced by the peaceful hum of the engine and the promise of a brighter future. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, bringing peace to the restless spirits and honoring the memory of those who had been lost. Together, they would continue their journey, guided by the light of truth and the strength of their bond.